Namaste to all the viewers, and welcome back to another discussion on the unmaking of Hindu civilization. This is a sequel to our previous episode, the case study of Bengal, where we discussed various uh, things related to the history of Bengal and how intellectual civilization was degraded in a sense. So, so in our part one, we had discussed several things. So that about how that even through centuries of Islamic rule, even with all kinds of brutalities, the forced conversions, temple destruction, the jizya, and all through that, we see that Hindu elites, they never start thinking of themselves through the eyes of the conquerors. But so they learn Persian for their administration, but they never internalize the kind of contempt that Islamic traditions have for Hindus. They were able to simply dismiss it as adharmic in a sense. But the contrast is seen when the British arrive. That within 50 to 100 years of their arrival, the very people who are collaborating with their presence, they are not just collaborating in their administration, but turning out against their own civilizational values. We gave the example of the sons of the men who built Hindu college, who started eating beef later, the Derosians. They call their own religion superstitious and everything, and they used to heap contempt on their own culture as well. So yes, so from the many aspects that we discussed in the previous stream, today we would like to particularly delve into the Orientalist hidden barb behind this that thought process that was there in the minds of Hindu elites in those days. The idea of the golden age and the dark age. So yes, Rishi or Nocturnal Patriot, any thoughts on this before we start?
Yeah, welcoming all the audience today for the second stream of the series. And as Nina has told us, so on that line of thought that we had expressed in our previous stream, uh, tonight we will be delving into another significant portion which actually shaped the mental picture of India, current Indians about their past. And that's a big deal because many of us also hear this all the time that the way that you perceive your past, that's how then you will try making even policies at the present times as well. So this is an this is a crucial issue, and we should really be investigating into it with all seriousness if we have to um get into deep dive about how there were disintegrations of our own frameworks later on as well, as we shall see. Uh, Nocturnal or Niner can take forward.
Yes, so as my friends have pointed out, deracination didn't just happen in one swipe. There was a cause behind it, and there were many factors to it. So here we are attempting to shed light on what could have happened and the different phenomena that basically led to this sea change in mentality of the Hindus who had been able to safeguard their mentality, at least largely, in spite of the constant bombarding by the invaders for such a long time. Because even during the Islamic subjugation, we were very much a colony. What changed between the Islamic subjugation and the British colonization is what we are trying to unearth. So a lot went on, and hopefully through our series of podcasts we'll be able to shed light on some of the situations that actually led to this sea change in thought.
So yes, so that was our introduction. Um, a little bit more on what we're exactly going to discuss today. So, part one in general, it shows us the effects of what was actually going on. But behind the scenes, there were a lot of mechanisms playing out with certain epistemologies and ideas that we did not truly have the time to discuss the last time. Specifically, what did this group of British administrators and the scholars actually do to the Hindu traditions in the name of studying these traditions? What were the frameworks they were approaching them with? And in the process of, you can say, constructing their own narratives, what kind of image were they seeing in Hinduism? And finally, uh, relating back to the initial point of the stream, um, how did this kind of framework become the mirror in which the Hindu elites eventually learned to see themselves? So, yes, that is our core thesis. More correctly pointed out. So, our thesis is supposed to be that the Orientalists did not exactly discover India. They were producing a kind of a version of India which was filtered through particular lenses. Those lenses we should shortly discover. So yes, also a brief note that we should be discussing the period from 1770 roughly to 1817, because 1817 is the same year as when Hindu College was founded, and also the same year when James Mill writes his The History of British India. He publishes it, and that is the time when you can say the Anglicists take over the narrative from the Orientals. So we shall be covering that part in a later stream. But yes, I just wanted to point that out. So yes, we start off with the time period after the Battle of Plassey. So Plassey had been won in 1757, and many years passed as well. We saw a lot of events covered in the previous stream about how there was a famine, the kind of loot that Robert Clive had done, and Warren Hastings had to go there and come back to England, to India, to actually clean up the wreckage after the famine. So there was a lot of administrative, you can say, cleanup going on, and lot of reforms going on within uh, the whole time period itself. So yes, in all this time, the company itself, it was facing a lot of challenges in governing the populace. It was essentially collapsing in its own philosophy, in a sense. So that's where you can say Warren Hastings comes into the picture. So about Warren Hastings. So Hastings is probably one of the most fascinating figures in this entire story because he kind of refuses to resolve into a simple character. Neither a villain nor a hero, but he is quite unsettling even then, even without being either. So his story, as everyone knows, that he came to Bengal and at the age of 17 as a junior company writer, just to do things like accounting and so on. And in those early years itself, he got fairly competent in Indian languages, or particularly you can say Persian and Urdu, or which was called Hindustani in those days. This kind of distinguished him from the other you can say rookies in the English establishment in the East India Company, and he was quite well known in those years itself. He of course he went back to England after some point, and he came back here in 1772 once more. That's where our story begins. He comes back and he becomes a governor general, pretty much the top post in the East India Company at the time. So when he comes back, he starts building this coterie around him of a small group of very gifted company servants who were actually learned and so on, who began engaging with the literature and learning of you can say Indian scriptures and so on. Particularly, the names would be Charles Wilkins, who arrived in 1770, then Nathaniel Halhed, and Jonathan Duncan, who later became Governor General in Bombay. So then later, there even comes William Jones, who was personally invited by Hastings, but he would come a little bit later in around 1780s. So Hastings, he was so invested in this project that he actually offered financial incentives through the company's money for the translation work. He tried to even establish a professorship at Oxford. Then he channeled a lot of official documents written in Persian and Urdu through Wilkins' new press, the press which Charles Wilkins had started. Charles Wilkins was also the same person who actually completed the first Bengali printing typeface, which was probably the first in India in the vernacular languages. So yes, so this essentially you can see the kind of a theme here that Hastings comes with the motive of ruling India better, that to rule effectively, that he also says that to rule effectively, that the administrators they must love India, and to love India, they must be able to communicate with the people of India. So, and of course, to communicate with them, you have to learn their languages. So, yes, essentially, it boiled down to a problem of governance. That was the first part. After this, we of the many of the coterie he had surrounding him, there was Halhed, Nathaniel Halhed, who I mentioned earlier. He was probably the first major Orientalist under him, who, under Hastings' orders, commissioned what became the Code of Gentoo Laws, which was published in 1776. And this code was basically an attempt to compile Hindu law into a definitive written code that the judges in the courts of the East India Company would actually use to provide justice in a more, you can say, um, understandable manner to them. Because till then, actually, they were working through interpreters or outsourcing the justice, you can say, the judgments to others. And this was causing a lot of problems, as you can imagine. So they wanted an authority which they could access themselves in this instance. This particular code of Gentoo laws is an interesting example that the way it was translated and everything, that 11 pundits were assembled and they were instructed to draw on the best authorities and lay down, in quote unquote, lay down the law once and for all. So this was supposed to be a definitive text on Hindu law. So the Sanskrit digest that the Pandits produced, that was then translated to Persian through another translator, a native translator, and from Persian, Nathaniel Halhed, he translates that into English, adding his own substantial preface. And the result was published as far as in London as well. There were a lot of readers in across Europe of this text. Many people, such as even Edmund Burke, had read it and commented about it as the most ancient book of laws in the world, and so on. So, yes, it was quite a substantial achievement from their point of view. But from a practical standpoint, one might say that it was a complete failure because the courts were unable to use it as a definitive authorities for their stretch, for their judgments. Basically, it provided the pundits with another source to interpret because they had to fall back on, again, pundits to interpret those meanings and so on. It was a literal translation in that sense, not something that you could um, definitively use in matters. So, yes, this was, but still, it was the first attempt at trying to incorporate Hindu legislation into the English East India Company's system. That must not be forgotten. So, on this instance, I would like to also discuss or I would like to read out the first, the preface of this, which was actually written by Warren Hastings himself. So you can tell something about the importance of this whole project by the fact that the Governor General himself was writing a preface to it. In just a moment, I should be sharing my screen. So just a second. I seem to have some problem with sharing my screen. Just a second.
In the meantime, I would request the audience to like, share, and subscribe the channel and keep supporting us for further brilliant contents like such. Yeah, here.
Is the screen visible?
Yes,
Yes.
it's visible. Perfect.
Yes, so just a second. So this is the preface to the Code of Gentoo Laws, which was written by Warren Hastings himself. So this is in the beginning. It's an exchange of letters between Warren Hastings and Nathaniel Hallhead. So we go down a little. So some excerpts I want to point out, which kind of explain what their worldview was when they were trying to translate and work with these texts. So just a moment. Yes, so we start with the first page. Here there is an interesting line here that I have. The letter starts in this manner. I have now the satisfaction to transmit to you a complete and corrected copy of a translation of the Gentoo Code, executed with great ability, diligence, and fidelity by Mr. Halhead from a Persian version of the original Sanskrit, which was undertaken by the immediate inspection of the Pandits or compilers of the work. Then he goes on to say, I could have wished to obtain an omission or amendment of some passages to have rendered them more fit, but the Pandits, when desired to revise them, could not be prevailed upon to make any alterations, as they declared they had the sanctions of their Shastra and were therefore incapable of amendment. Possibly, these may be considered as essential parts of the work, since they mark principles on which many of the laws are formed, and bear the stamp of very remote antiquity, and so on and so on. So you can notice a kind of urge from the pundits in these sentences that they were uncompromising, essentially, right? Even if you can say to appeal to the morality of the public eye, that in this instance would probably be the English themselves. They did not change the shastra of what they said. They were willing to show it as it is and did not want to make any alterations, even though the authority of the land, that was the East India Company, who could have actually punished them for not obeying them, but they still did not compromise on the principles outlined there. That is one thing that is of note here. Going ahead, there was, yes, so this part. Here he talks about the reasons for the translation and why it must be done. So a lot of things are said about the kind of laws of different countries and so on. Uh, Here we see the reference to Romans, that nothing can so favorably conduce to these 2 points as a well-timed toleration in matters of religion and adoption or such original institutes of the country as do not immediately clash with the laws or interests of the conquerors. To a steady pursuance of this great maximum, much of the success of the Romans may be attributed who not only allowed to their foreign subjects the free exercise of their own religion and the administration of their own civil jurisdiction, but sometimes by policies still more flattering, even naturalized such parts of the mythology of the conquered as were in any respect compatible with their own system. This part is probably the most important that I would like to discuss with Rishi and Nocturnal Patriot if you like. That this is the essentially this kind of naturalizing, or you can say accommodating exactly what kind of outcomes it might lead to.
Yeah, Nocturnal, any points you have?
Okay, I think we don't have many points on this, but there is another section that we might have interest in discussing. So, I think it was on this page. So, yes, the point about how the Pandits and the Brahmins were unwilling to compromise on the principles or the as what the Shastra said, that comes up here again. So, in this paragraph, it says, in a track so untrodden as this, many paths must be attempted before we can hit upon the right. We owe much to every person who ends so and so. Then it comes to the present work, however, is the only one of this nature ever undertaken by authority, the only instance in which the Brahmins have ever been persuaded to give up a part of their consequence for the general benefit of the whole community. And the present pen of the translator must be considered as an entirely passive instrument by which the laws are ushered into the world from those Brahmins themselves. So it kind of highlights that how exactly unwilling they were to collaborate with them in this whole matter, and that they had to get a whole Persian translation and everything done for that.
Yes, one thing becomes evident from this passage, that they were some for some reason they were viewing the Brahmins as an impediment to their natural way of interpretation. So it shows that the Brahmins in some way were resisting their kind of interpretation, because uh, apparently the British were, or rather Hastings and his coterie, were viewing the Shastras from their distinct lens and were attempting to dumb it down according to their own perspective, which is something that the Brahmins were opposed to, because the Brahmins knew what the Shastras implied. Those implications, the raw implications, were not liked necessarily by the British, and the British wanted to color it in their perspective. That is where the probable friction could have risen, and that is possibly what Hastings is referring to.
Yes. So also going ahead, there is uh, quite an interesting paragraph here, which actually acknowledges the point of the other side as well. So they do acknowledge that religion should have been judged by the principles and truths of its own, you can say, uh, thesis. So, so yes, he brings up the point that hence we are not justified in grounding the standard and criterion of our examination of the Hindu religion upon the known and infallible truth of our own, despite him calling that an infallible truth, because the opposite party would either deny the first principles of our argument or insist upon an equal right on their side to suppose the veracity of their own scriptures uncontrovertible. So yes, so he was actually giving the space, but despite all this effort, it turns out a problematic translation. So yes, that was the first part on, and that was the experiment that Nathaniel Hallhead did. Then we come to the next excerpt that I would like to discuss. This would be one of the letters of Warren Hastings to a certain Nathaniel Smith from the translation of Charles Wilkins' Bhagavad Gita. This comes up a few pages later. A lot of things are basically outlined in this. Basic things that, at least how they saw the religion and our, you can say, our itihasas, and how they portrayed them in under their mythological lens of Greek and Roman culture or their own Christian worldviews, so on. That comes up. But I would like to point to something else here. Uh, so yes, the comparisons you can see here, that here Warren, sorry, yes, Warren Hastings, he tries to bring up the comparisons. It will not be fair to try its relative worth by comparison with the original text or the first standards of European composition, but let these be taken even in the most esteemed of their prose translation, and in that equal scale, let their merits be weighted. I should not fear to place in opposition to the best French versions the most admired passages of the Iliad or Odyssey, or of the first and sixth books of our own Milton, highly as I venerate the latter, the English translation of the Mahabharata. These are quite some interesting points. And another aspect comes up in this part itself. Just a moment. I think it is here. Right, right. So it comes up here. Um, so this was an attempt to introduce a knowledge of Hindu literature into the European world by no, this
And
was
there was probably yet another thing that colored their perspective that we must bring up. The fact that many of the British, at least, were convinced that the industrialization uh, and the industrial advancement that they had achieved was achieved by excluding the church from most of the affairs, because the church had often resisted much of their progress. The church had been an impediment to
yes,
their
and
progress.
specifically
So
because England was Protestant, they had a kind of you can say anti-priest, anti-clerical attitude as well,
precisely, yes. So they were very
and they
anti-clergy.
projected Catholic
Naturally,
priests onto Brahmins.
yes, that was taking place here. We can say so.
Yes, so yes, this was a line which I wanted to point out. So, very natural causes may be ascribed for their reluctance to communicate the mysteries. This is said about the Brahmins. Very natural causes may be ascribed for the reluctance to communicate the mysteries of their learning to strangers, as to whom they have been for some centuries in subjection. That he is referring to Muslim rule. never inquired into them, but to turn their religion into derision. He's talking about Muslims basically degrading the Hindu religion, that they were not making an effort to engage with Hindu religion or deduce from them arguments to support intolerant principles of their own. But now he says, from our nation, they have received a different treatment and are no less eager to impart their knowledge than we are to receive it. I could say much more in proof of this fact, but that it might look too much self commendation. So, this is an interesting thing that either it's Warren Hastings' own impression or it was actually something happening that they actually were far less intolerant and more accepting of the what the Hindu Shastras are trying to claim. So yes, this is something he tries to bring up. But also at the same time, he is trying to compare British Orientalism favorably to Muslim rule to say that British have come to understand them rather than destroy them like the previous invaders. So he's also already making that claim that this kind of colonization is benevolent compared to the past.
Yeah, this is kind of like his ice breaking attempt, and he's like advertising that they have done a better job at breaking the ice than prior
Yes.
colonizers. And yeah, he shows that they have been more willing to engage with the Brahmins to know their ways. So the Brahmins should also take a step forward and engage with them. And maybe some did.
Although I would say there there might be some part of, how should I frame it? So there might be some portions of ignorance within him as well, because we know that from Mughal times, there were some attempts to engage with the Hindu religion, and the exact uh, arguments for justifying the rule of Mughals in India, even that was also attempted by some of the courtiers, like
He does
Abul
bring
Fazl
that
in
up.
his Akbarnama.
He does bring it up.
Hmm.
He brings up that there were attempts by the prior colonizers to justify their intolerant practices. So he brings it up. But
Yes,
again,
he does bring it.
he does bring it up. But the point is that we must remember that he is building his impressions largely on what he sees in Calcutta, largely Calcutta. So yeah.
Yes, the particular two cities he was spending most time on was Banaras and Calcutta. He wrote this letter in Banaras. So yes, some more context about the letter itself. He was in Banaras. His entire this was around the time when the entire council was hostile against him. There was he was um, facing that case and everything, and he was in this condition that he wrote this preface and everything. So one more thing I would like to, one more excerpt I would like to prime point out here is this one. I should read it out for the viewers. Nor is the cultivation of language and science, for such are the studies to which I allude, useful only in the forming the moral character and habits of the service. Every accumulation of knowledge, and especially such as is obtained by social communication with people over whom we exercise a dominion founded on the right of conquest, is useful to the state. It is a gain of humanity. In the specific instance which I have stated, it attracts and conciliates distant affections. It lessens the weight of the chain by which the natives are held in subjection, and it imprints on the hearts of our own countrymen the sense of obligation of benevolence. Even in England, this effect is of it is greatly wanting. It is not very long since the inhabitants of India were considered by many as creatures scarce elevated above the degree of savage life. Nor, I fear, is that prejudice yet wholly eradicated, though surely abated. Every instance which brings their real character home to observation will impress us with more generous feeling of for their natural rights and teach us to estimate them by the measure of our own. But such instances can only be obtained in their writings, and these will survive when the British dominion in India shall have long ceased to exist, and when the sources which it once yielded of wealth and power are lost to remembrance.
So we do
So,
see here an inherent racism.
Yes, and you notice that the part where he says, "Over whom we exercise a dominion founded on the right of conquest." He explicitly knows what it is. He knows that there is a chain, that there is an oppression, there is a subjection that the natives are subject to, in his own words.
And he says that the natives were
And
scarcely regarded
yes,
anything above savages for a while until they
yes.
came with the light of colonization. Like, yeah, light of Christianity, light of
So
colonization,
his
whatever.
whole argument rests on the fact that this literature producing, this translation project of Orientalists, this would basically allow Indians to be seen as more human by the government, the
Yeah, so
state,
he was here
the
to
East
save
India.
them. That complex remains.
Yes. So you see the relation between power and knowledge in this instance, the knowledge production, you can call it. So yes, that was on Warren Hastings. Next person I would like to move on to is William Jones. This person is a very colorful character, and he expands upon the project which Warren Hastings started in a more profound way. So he my argument in in this part would be that the Jones, he did not actually come to discover what India had as in literature or anything, but more so that he was discovering a mirror for what he had already previously learned, the frameworks that were taught in European culture and so on. So all the intellectual obsessions that he was engaging with, all of those things you see reflected back in what he searches for in India and Indian scriptures and so on. And I
Yeah,
shall
it's
call
clear
you
that he had come here with a frame, a prior frame in his mind,
yes,
and he wanted to make India fit into that frame. He was not curious to know about what India was, but rather to make India fit into that frame, which would make India easy to govern.
yes, correct. That's absolutely correct. So a moment.
In the meantime, to the audience, I will just try to explain this portion, which Nainer will be going further in details. So we'll try to check up this four-part checklist. This is a formulation made by Martin Farek in his book India in the Eyes of Europeans. So we'll try to see that how Orientalists had this notion, this four-part checklist notion of namely structural markers of Christianity to be found in India. What are those? Number one, a supreme deity. Number two, an authoritative holy book. Number three, a definitive creed. And number four, a formal priesthood. So these are the 4 points that we'll be trying to search now from the works of William Jones.
So yes, something a little bit about William Jones himself, his life and everything. He actually came from quite a well-known, renowned family as well. His father was a member of the Royal Society and a friend of Isaac Newton, as you might know. An interesting fact is that in the you can say the controversy between Newton and Leibniz as to who discovered calculus first. His father was actually one of the judges who was present to determine who actually discovered it first. So, anyways, that aside. That just to point out his lineage in a sense. So he arrived in Calcutta in September 1783, and he already by then he was quite a celebrated linguist in Europe, not just England. He was around 50 years old at that time, if I'm correct. And in the 11 years that he would spend in India, he only spent 11 years. He would do this extraordinary amount of scholarship in that brief 11 years. He came essentially as a judge of the Supreme Court, and his ideological framework, which he came with, was called Whig constitutionalism. As you know, England had two traditional parties, the Whigs and the Tories. He was also a man who had mastered many languages, For example, Arabic, Persian specifically. He was he was himself Welsh, so he knew Welsh as well. And of course, he had the classical training, so he knew Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and those languages of Europe as well, French and others. So he had quite a big reputation in Europe already before he came to India. So I read a particular biography of Jones, which was written by Garland Cannon, and which is quite informative about many aspects of his life. So um, so in July 1783, when he is still on the sea voyage to India, he has actually not ever read any Indian text. He has not read a single word of Sanskrit even. So he is completely unfamiliar with India. And despite that, what is interesting is he composes what he calls an andrometer, so a self-testing list that what will be my objectives when I come to India. The objectives that he outlines are quite interesting when we see this. So, just a moment. I have a screenshot of this. I can share my screen here. Is this visible?
Yeah,
Not yet.
clearly.
No.
Yes, yes. So you can notice the kind of the themes that he was actually already decided in his head without any knowledge of India that he was trying to discover. First, the Hindu and Muslim laws, which were natural because he was going to be a judge in India. Then, history of the ancient world, that is also all right. Third, scriptural proofs and illustrations. Here is where it gets interesting. Fourth, traditions about the flood, the flood being the biblical flood, the deluge, what they call it. Fifth, Indian geography and politics. Then, best mode of governing Bengal, and it goes so on, so on, so on. He also talks about later the Mughal constitution and the Maratha constitution. So, uh, the particular point I wanted to point out was about the traditions of the about the flood. Why would you be interested in that specifically? So he
Fit.
and the idea that he had already decided this before knowing a thing about India, that really surprises me, because what this means for us is that he already had this Christian providentialist framework. He was coming to India to find knowledge which would serve the purpose of Christianity. So, yes, we must keep that in mind when we learn more about him. Any points on this, Rishi or Nocturne Patriot?
Yeah, we can see this clearly now. He's trying to map on his own religious stories onto us as well, because there is this tendency, right? Uh, even by that time, that since Christian Bible is true, therefore the events in Christian Bibles must also be recorded in other civilizations as well, and that we need to find out. At
It's a
least
case of
that's the vibe that I'm
confirmation bias, basically. They want validation, greater validation from the greater world for their existing sensibilities. So, which
Yes,
it'll
exactly.
help them, propagate their religion and expand their flock, as they say in Christianity. So, since they seek to increase the size of their flock, they want greater acceptance from people there. So, if they can somehow uh, establish that they have a common past with the people they are colonizing, it'll help them, further that project.
Although I doubt William Jones wanted to increase any flock, but yeah, he was a Christian after all, even in value terms as well. I don't know if he was
Yes,
a
I mean,
religious Christian or not.
maybe it was not in terms of converting people, but still, they had this fantasy of validating certain sensibilities that they had, that the entire world
No,
was
it was
connected.
not in the sense of converting directly. My belief is that they wanted to project India in such a fashion that Indians would believe, or at least they would find out that Indians were actually pretty much Christians already. So, yes.
Yeah, we have this quotation as well from many books that Europeans operated under a theological axiom: because God created all humans, every culture must have an inherent capacity for religion, making religion a universal human trait rather than a culturally specific Western concept. And the religion, aka Christianity, no doubt, not some other religion.
Ah, so, yes, I should move on with discussing more of William Jones. So, in January 1784, just a few months after he comes to Bengal, Jones founds the Asiatic Society of Bengal. So, the charter of it was sweeping that basically every branch of human knowledge that was in that would be from Asia would be in its scope. And its journal, the Asiatic Researches, that became the primary publication venue for Orientalist scholarship, which was soon being spread all over Europe. A lot of people across, you can say, France, Germany. It was not just in England; everywhere it was spreading. But the society's founding discourse already contained kind of vision about what the project was actually for. Uh, I believe in the first, what it's called, the first, the transaction or something. It's called in the first founding discourse probably. He says that if our countrymen here will learn that wealth is not the only pursuit for rational beings, my object in proposing and supporting the society will be attained. So his idea was that the East India Company servants there in India, they were quite degenerates, in his own words. That and he saw this society partly as a way of a moral correction to these colonial servants, so that they could engage themselves with literature and scholarship rather than with hoarding money and corruption and all that, because he generally found the corruption quite morally appalling. He would go as far as to say that among all the judges of the Supreme Court, he and one other alone were the non-corrupt ones. So yes,
So
he
yeah, making his
was
own
quite,
officers more civil was also one of the objectives of this grand project,
yes.
to help them, find better life goals rather than just looting and wasting away their time in India.
I'm also getting some vibes of what you had described from that letter of Warren Hastings as well, right? The whole civilized. We are the civilized colonists, unlike the other bunch which had been subjecting you to their despotism.
Yes,
So I'm getting
and
those vibes
therefore
as well.
and therefore the onus lies on the civilized lot to also appear civil. So it was like, they play in a way, they placed greater standards on themselves, so therefore we must exhibit better standards by through our conduct. So we must also, uh, we shouldn't emulate unwashed savages, we shouldn't act like money grubbers, we should, we should be able to have
we
a
should be
higher
better
moral
than our
ground.
predecessors. Yes,
Yes,
yes.
better than our predecessors, and also we should stand out as examples to the savages who are supposed to look up to us.
Yeah, and it will cement their
Yes.
rule as well, right? If they start acting belligerently, then it will be a problem. They knew it because I think by that time, the sannyasi revolt was also emerging, right, Nina?
Yes, but that actually never comes up as a theme in these writings for some reason. That
Of
is
course,
an
of course.
interesting thing you pointed out.
Mhm.
So yes, we discussed about that stuff. There is also something about the frameworks that Jones was approaching, not just not just, you can say, the colonial institutions and everything, but the actual frameworks behind it. So he didn't just bring the English language or English literature and so on, but he had, I have simplified it into four frameworks that I think that which were sometimes contradictory, but they were basically guiding him in his worldview. First is, of course, as we saw in the objects of inquiry list, that was a Christian providentialism. That one more evidence of this is that in Jones' daily study schedule in India, eh, basically what he learned daily, apart from Sanskrit grammar and from translating his works, he also read 10 chapters of the Bible daily. So he was a practicing Christian and a devout one, probably. So, and as we saw, he refers to the deluge or the flood. So when Jones reads, so the question that arises in our mind would be that when Jones reads these Puranic texts and he tries to translate them, is he not asking that he's basically not asking what is this tradition saying on its own terms. He is essentially searching for that flood, or he's searching for other concepts such as Trinity, or he's searching for the concepts such as um, how the world was divided between Noah's sons and so on. And as we will see ahead, he actually kind of tries to fit India into the framework of being in that, you can say, sons of Ham and so on, right?
Yeah, clearly. Rather songs of like, I mean, we will discuss that soon enough.
Yeah. And you see in his annual discourses to Asiatic society as well, this basically becomes a foundation. Uh, there are a lot of motivated comparisons they made. First, they try to fit biblical chronology into Hindu frameworks, try to fit Manu into their Adam, and so on. They also try to compare the Devanagari with Hebrew, that apparently the Brahmi scripts come from Hebrew. Then to the modern scholarship, of course, it looks like conspiracy theories right now, but to back then, they were taking it literally and very, very seriously.
Absolutely.
So the second framework that would shape his worldview would be European, you can say, classical humanism, essentially. And who were the ideals of these classical humanism? Basically, people like Homer from Greece or Milton and Shakespeare from England itself. So whenever he was reaching out for Sanskrit or Hindu literature, he immediately would reach for the kind of classical analogy to fit it into his European frameworks, essentially. So he was trying to, and we also noticed that in the letters of Hastings, right, where he compares, um, what was that, to Mahabharata to, I think, Milton, if I'm correct. That
Yes,
kind
yes,
of,
yes. You did.
yeah, so that kind of comparison, it is basically trying to force Hindu texts into their prestige systems or in their elite societies, essentially. And we see some disastrous consequences of this, that he tries across many, many translations to force eroticism that from, say, Greek or Latin literature into Sanskrit texts. Then he also tries to find the Vedanta in Pythagoras or Plato's theories, and a lot of strange things we would dismiss as conspiracy theories, no, but people took it seriously back then. And finally, there is one interesting poem which is not talked about much, but I think it would be interesting to talk about. It's called. It was unfinished. He never actually finished it, and I'm not sure if the whole manuscript is available at all or not. But it is referred to in many of his biographies. It's called Britain Discovered. So this was a project that Jones was writing for years, and he was essentially using Hindu gods and Hindu mythology as a machinery for the for a poem about English history. For example, he what is it? There was Britain's founding of Albion, and in this poem, he tries to portray our Hindu god Shiva as opposing this Albion with his own kind of a decorative apparatus around the Hindu gods. This would be an explicitly political poem, actually. So yes, this is basically how it devolves into a classical humanist framework.
Yeah,
And
and it also fits
finally,
into.
yes,
Hmm.
yes,
No, just a short point. It also fits into the retelling which were happening, right, with Greek god and their activities uh, at that time, with the literature which were coming out, ST Coleridge and so on. They were doing these sort of things as well. Just wanted to tell the congruence
yes,
in
pretty
that
much.
sort of
They
pattern.
were also trying to equate the Greek gods and mythologies into, or they were trying to find equivalents in Hindu gods. That would happen, or
Yeah, yeah,
that continues to happen even today, unfortunately.
true, true, true. It's that part. Yeah, Nina, please.
So, yeah, yeah. So,
Yeah, they
um,
constantly had this tendency of appropriating gods of different pantheons, gods of the old pre-Christian pantheons, and representing them in poetry, in their fantasies, so called, and to give them a place in the current system, but obviously to assign subordinate roles, of course, because in the grand scheme of things. Because, of course, their mindset was always an Abrahamic one, but they had this fascination of using uh, the gods of different pantheons as props or as characters with distinctly defined roles.
so moving on to more of the frameworks that Jones was engaging with. So, this is the third one, which people would not be aware of in India, especially because this becomes part of the politics of England. Jones was a very committed political reformist in England. His particular ideology was called Whig constitutionalism. As people might know, there are two traditional parties in England, but with the Whig and the Tories. Tories would tend to be conservative, and Whigs would tend to be liberal in a sense. And Jones was committed to this Whig side. So uh, he believed in the he believed in the divinity of the English Constitution. You could not put it in any other way. He was very committed to the idea of the rule of law and had a hatred for arbitrary power. So that is why he also comes up with the idea of codifying Hindu laws, which made him see himself as a Justinian in terms of what Justinian was to the Roman Republic. So he
Seeing
actually
codes of
writes,
conduct and law books as divine is something that they kind of inherited. Like most of the Abrahamics have had this. Like the Ten Commandments were handed
yes,
to Moses by their God themselves, God Himself. The similar thing can be said about the Quran. So they have had this history of acquiring law books from above. So
yes, and Justinian was the one who basically first implemented it is in a state format, the Roman Empire.
Hmm.
So he actually uses the comparison himself in a letter to Macpherson. I would not be thought purposing to be made the Justinian of India. So he does make the comparison himself that he's trying to be as great as that. That you can sense the kind of ego also because he came from that kind of aristocratic background, and so it would not be seen as too high, too you can say condescending to say even something like that. But yes, that happened. So so what this assumes basically is that the codified written law is superior to the actual living customary practice or the interpretational practice, and that the diversity of Hindu legal tradition is a deficiency to be corrected through this new kind of constitutionalism and legal culture. This constitutionalism is the reason why we they try to codify Manusmriti and other laws into their frameworks. And here's where an interesting character enters. That is Edmund Burke. As many might know, that he is called the father of conservatism in England, and also you can call it in across the Western world specifically. So Edmund Burke, he had actually helped Jones, despite him being on the opposite side of the political spectrum, secure his Bengal appointment. partly because he expected Jones to report honestly on what Warren Hastings' uh, conduct was. But Jones did not do that. So, in Garland Cannon's biography, the Burgess Edmund Burke's threat is actually recorded that if I hear that Jones sides with Hastings, I will do all in my power to have him record. And Jones even responds to him that a judge could side with no one. But this neutrality was forgotten soon enough because uh, Jones becomes a friend of Hastings and he begins defending what he calls Eastern despotism, which is apparently necessary for Hastings to uphold.
Wow.
So he condemns Hastings privately in discussions, but publicly he always protects him because he saw his friendship as a justification for that. So essentially, all that constitutionalism, all that liberalism, all that love for rule of law, that was limited to, you can say, principles. He did not actually practice it. And despite him seeing corruption everywhere in Bengal, he actually goes as far as to claim that he was among the only two men in the entire Supreme Court who were actually honest and not corrupt. He did not really act on it much, apart from all this literature, delving into the literature and hoping that it would produce a more a non-corrupt elite among the English, I suppose. So yes, that was one of his frameworks. And the final framework, which is probably the most underappreciated and which was quite interesting for me to delve into, was that Jones was a complete Persophilia, Persophile, basically, that he loved Persian literature. He read and translated many works, probably in the hundreds, in his entire life. And so his entire outlook on the Oriental world, or the East, you can call it, was shaped by his outlook on Persia. So when he actually encountered Sanskrit or Hindu texts, he would always try to fix it somewhere in the Persian frameworks as well. So that is also why he placed the Indo-European homeland in Persia. He suggests some quite bizarre, wild theories, such as that Hindu kingdoms were located in Persian territory before the Zoroastrians. Then, then there is a very famous anecdote that I would like to point out the kind of irony that which is documented by Garland Cannon that after arriving in India, he actually attempts to speak in Persian with a fellow company servant, but the company servant does not actually understand him because all his Persian knowledge was, despite him being so much in love with it, he was all bookish knowledge basically. He could not actually speak it, and the person who he spoke to, he thought he was speaking English. So yes, essentially his idea of India, like his idea of Persian or Persia, they were basically library texts, you can call it, that he had kind of imagined much of it, and he was not really engaging with the living traditions of it. Then we also see his relationship with Sanskrit. So it was not very different from the way he approached Persian. He wanted to learn it. He went to the the Brahmins of Nadia in Bengal and also to Benares and other places. But of course, he was rejected back then. A foreigner, a judge, or someone who was of the state, they would not necessarily teach him. The Brahmins were very hostile to the idea of teaching him, taking him as a student. But he eventually finds a Vaidya named Ramalochana, who was actually a physician, who agreed to teach him under very strict conditions, which Jones had problems with, but he agreed for the time being. Uh, so he also finds out that this same Ramalochana also teaches grammar to many of the learned Brahmins, despite him being not of the Brahmin class himself. After learning Sanskrit, though, he tries to position himself as the more authoritative interpreter, arguing that since Ramalochana taught even Brahmins, he is kind of superior to them, having learned from him.
Wow.
So you can kind of see the kind of insecurity he had from the earlier rejection of not being taught directly from a Brahmin.
Yeah, precisely so. That becomes clearly apparent here.
Also, this tendency
Yes.
of being superior than the native, this is also a very common trait within the European, like in European mindset as well at that time, right? So this is a reflection which I'm seeing, at least that of Alexandrian myth, like how Alexander is the pharaoh of the Egyptians and also the Shah of Persia. Like he's the overlord of the natives. When he comes over there, he becomes better than the native lords ever were. So I think that sort of mentality is also being projected over here, right? Or maybe
Precisely.
I'm wrong.
They know that
Pretty much.
whatever
Yes.
system exists, they need to be at the head of the system. So uh, they, I mean, they refuse to bow to the authority or to the existing authority in the system. They would want to position themselves as superior to whatever system that exists. So it's like they are not willing to play by the rules of the game. They are willing to flip the board so that they can stay in charge.
Completely. By the way, Nainer and Nocturnal, when you were discussing those portions about laws, right? So there was a rejection of the native digest which was made, right? The Gentoo law, which was a translation of a native Sanskrit work. Wasn't William Jones against it as well? Like he wrote a letter, right, about opposing this whole project of native formulation of the Gentoo law, and he wanted to systematize his own law, as you said, the Justinian code of his for the
Yeah,
Hindus.
because he
Wasn't
believed
that the
that
case?
any native
Let me
formulation is
clarify.
going to be inferior to his own. So that was very.
Let me clarify. He was not that opposed to it, but the Code of Gentoo laws actually was already composed and published before he came to India itself. So he learned about it at a later time. This I read out the preface from that just earlier, right? So his
Yes, yes.
contention was basically that it was more of a literal translation than you can say something that could be interpreted during uh, court judgments. So that is where he had the problem, and it was a translation of a text of you can say compilations by the Brahmins rather than particular text. He was insistent on finding the translation for Manusmriti. So yeah, he was that was the reason he probably rejected it.
An authoritative holy law book, I guess. Yeah, that sort of.
Yeah. So something more about Jones and how he saw um, India and Sanskrit in general. So the background to this is that in 1786 he delivers the third anniversary discourse of Asiatic Society. This was actually the attendance of this was the largest during his entire tenure because a lot of company servants actually started being interested into these things at that time. So and people actually knew something significant was coming. uh, this is a document from which the modern study of all Indo-European languages is also conventionally created. So I should read two passages from this. Yeah. So where is it? So it says the Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either, yet bearing to both of them a stronger affinity both in the roots of verbs and in the forms of grammar than could possibly have been produced by accident. So strong indeed that no philologer could examine them all three without believing them to have sprung from some common source, which perhaps no longer exists. There is a similar reason, though not quite so forcible, for supposing that both the Gothic and the Celtic, though blended with a very different idiom, had the same origin with the Sanskrit, and the old Persian might be added to the same family if this were the place for discussing any question concerning the antiquities of Persia. So that comes up. Then, uh, think it comes up. That was the first part. That uh, probably I have to search it in this.
Just wait here for a minute. So, what we see here is that read this portion, the chronology. Just go up. He
Oh, right,
com-
right. 260. Which part was it?
the missionaries compare Buddha with Christian missionaries.
Just a moment. I might have skipped it.
Yes, you were just there. Go to the part where they speak about the Buddha. I think
Did I skip it again? It might be here.
after that Gothic Celtic portion, go down, slow.
Yeah, this part.
Yes, yeah, that portion. This may be a proper place to ascertain.
Important one in the chronology of the Hindus. For the priests of Buddha left in Tibet and China, the precise epoch of his appearance, real or imagined, in this empire, and that
Was
information which had
compared
been
by the
preserved
Christian missionaries and scholars with our own era.
right. We
The
may
Christian
fix the time
missionaries
of
were
Buddha,
performing this
ninth great
equivalence
incarnation
experiment.
of Vishnu in the year 1014 before the birth of Christ.
Now the Kashmirians who boast of his descent in their kingdom. So Christ's descent. So even back then, there were some Kashmiris who believed that Christ had visited.
Maybe that this
Assert
sounds
that he
very
appeared on Earth about 2 centuries after Krishna, the Indian Apollo. So look, he calls Krishna the Indian Apollo, who took so decided a part in the war of Mahabharat. And if an etymologist were to suppose that the Athenians had embellished their poetical history of Pandyan's
there is a
expulsion,
lot of confusion.
look, he compares Pandavas with Pandyans. So, history of Pandyans' expulsion and restoration of Aegis with the Asiatic tale of the Pandus and Yudhishthir. So he compares the Greek tale of Pandyans' expulsion with the expulsion of Pandavas in the Mahabharata.
Next line, certain it is that Pandu Mandal is called by the Greeks the country of Pandion. This is another level. So you can kind of imagine the kind of brain rot they were discussing in those days.
Lots of false equivalences were going on.
Yes, so that was one part. Another thing I wanted to discuss was here. Yes, he writes a whole poem here. It's called the Geographical Poem of Dionysus. Um, I don't want to read the poem, but basically I'll read the section after this. So, says their sources of wealth are still abundant even after so many revolutions and conquests. In their manufactures of cotton, they still surpass all the world, and their features have most probably remained unaltered since the time of Dionysius. Nor can we reasonably doubt how degenerate and abased
So
so
he
ever the
again
Hindus
he's
may
racist.
now
He
appear.
says that the Hindus are degenerate and abased. No matter
Yes,
how degenerate and abased they now appear, back in the early age they were splendid.
yes. In arts and arms, happy in government, wise in legislation, and eminent in various knowledge. But since their civil history beyond the middle of the 19th century from the present time
He's
is
involved in a
involved in
cloud.
a cloud
So he calls our
uh,
Puranas fables. In a cloud of fables,
yes. So
we
they have
seem to
only four
possess
genuine
only
means of
four genuine
satisfying their
differences. Yeah.
curiosity. That is, first, their languages and letters. Secondly, their philosophy and religion. Third, actual remains of old sculpture and architecture. Fourth, the written memorials of the sciences and arts. So you can the Going back to the first stream, you
He
might have remembered
considers
the
only
idea we
these four
discussed of
to
the
be
golden age.
relevant sources of information. So yeah,
Yes, yes, yes. We had discussed the idea of the golden age that Orientalists propped up. This was the golden age which I'm referring to.
correct.
That this they call the modern Hindus degenerate and based, while propping up the idea of an early age where they were splendid in arts and arms, happy in government, and so on and so on, which is not very different from uh, probably their biblical things, right? That the in the earlier times before Adam ate the apple, everything was hunky dory, and then it goes all downhill, and so on. So
Yep.
that kind of worldview is imposed here.
Technically, it's said it's called as the pure origin story, romanticization of the Veda, like
Hmm.
hypothesizing that ancient India possessed a rational, text-based monotheistic faith, which is in the Vedas, that align with natural religion, completely like those church dogmas.
And we also have this
This,
idea in European history, right? They call the medieval ages the Dark Ages. The
Mhm.
Because they believe that church came and all the sciences were halted, and every the advance of science during
Yes.
the Greek period that did not move on ahead. So they had this
Hmm.
idea that after Galileo and everyone, then it all moves ahead somehow. After the breaking of the
Yep.
Catholic Church, essentially, despite the Catholic Church being the one who was engaging with Aristotle and others through, you can say, Aquinas and so on, right?
Completely, and hence the word Renaissance. It is
Yes,
harkening back to some golden age.
basically they're coming out of the Dark Age into the Golden Age, essentially. And we saw in part one how many of the Hindu elites were basically internalizing this, and
And
how
that's why
the
people
particular
speak of the
text we refer
Navajagar and
to
all
of
the Renaissance,
Ram
which
Ram
was
Basu.
needed. That was needed in India. I mean, they were like induced into thinking that we were also in need of a golden age, a deliverance from our dark past, uh, because
And it is convenient that
and a glorious
in the
past needs
same
to be
place
revived, much like
in
exactly.
Bengal, they're actually they do prop up the idea of a renaissance happening in the
Yes,
19th
precisely.
century.
They constantly hammer that thought into our heads, time and again.
That
Constantly,
there was a
Navajagaran,
renaissance
these
happening.
sort of words are used. Hmm.
Hmm. In the first episode, we also discussed how Ram Ram Basu also propagated the same idea of the golden age and so on in his own capacity. So yeah, that was there. So yeah, that was the reference from
Basically,
William
whoever was
James.
unhappy with their establishment at any point of time used that stick to beat the establishment and question it and say that, oh, we had days in the past when everything was hunky dory. That is what we are trying to revive. Everything in the past was beautiful, and those are the days we want to bring back.
Hmm. Yes. Uh, so one thing that is missing in our discussions, and especially in their discussions of the whole matter, is about the nature of knowledge production that they were doing. Specifically, how they were extracting knowledge. This comes up in several instances. For example, in Wilkins' Gita, exactly how he gets it. Then it comes Halhead's Code of Gentoo Laws. Then even in the case of William Jones himself, they would always approach Pandit, and the Pandits would give their legal opinions or interpret the manuscript for them and give it to them. So, these men, they are essentially practically entirely absent from the published record. We never find out their names or anything. They are simply mentioned as assistants, informants, helpers, and so on. So yes, that aspect is there. That despite it being a collaborative production, the Europeans essentially appropriated the knowledge as they liked it and kept it and so on. Yes. So going ahead, uh, over the years, the lot of publications are published and so on. The kind of writings we read of Jones, those are proliferated in a mass manner, practically industrialized. Because there are, by the 1790s, there are several Orientalists working on such products and so on. So, but as we saw, this all this knowledge is actually being transmitted through pundits or through other sources. Uh, the nature of this mediation, though, that was sometimes dubious, as we shall see in the part ahead. So, yes, by 1800, Lord Wellesley he establishes Fort William College explicitly for the purpose that the Asiatic Society had purported, but for governance. So the institutional logic was also found by them. I would like to bring up another excerpt here that we can probably discuss. So yes, this would be. So here we can discuss something from the preface of Gentoo laws again. Uh, about 1 second. Oh, we have already discussed this, right? I think. Right, we have already discussed this. Apologies. We can move on to the next part about another Orientalist which I discovered who was an interesting character. His name is Francis Wilford. This is where the whole Orientalist, you can say, project becomes an interesting has an interesting moment. So this Francis Wilford was a military officer and actually a committed member of the Asiatic Society. He wrote extensively in this Asiatic researches, especially on the topic of geography. He would try to bring up Quranic texts and he would compare them with biblical geographic references and so on. So essentially, he was working with the framework that Jones was making, basically finding references to the flood, finding references to the Garden of Eden, then finding references to, you can say, Noah's sons and the ways they dispersed and so on in Sanskrit writings. His work was quite well read and cited a lot in Europe. In 1805, though, Wilford actually publishes in one of his writings a confession that this confession I would like to share with all of you. This comes up, share my screen shortly. Is it visible?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, it's visible.
Yes. So first I want to introduce to the nature of the work itself. So you can see, the name of the essay is An Essay on the Sacred Isles in the West, with other essays connected with that work by Captain F. Wilford, the same guy. So he brings up in, you can see the notion of the sacred isles, and what these sacred isles are quite interesting if you think about it. Yeah. So we read here that the sacred isles in the west, of which Shweta or the White Island is the principal and the most famous, are in fact the holy land of the Hindus. They are the fundamental and mysterious transactions of the history of the religion and its rise and progress took place. The White Island, this holy land in the west, capital west, is so intimately connected with the religion mythology that they cannot be separated. And of course, divines in India are necessarily acquainted with it, as distant Musalmans with Arabia. So he props up the idea of a Shweta Dvipa in, you can say, the west of India. You can imagine where it is. And going further, he says
And
that
he
this I
proposes that, the divines in India, the gods of India, are acquainted with Shvetadvipa, as well as the Musalmans are acquainted with Arabia. So he ascribes that much like the Musalmans of India have a sort of sacred land in the west, in their west known as Arabia, the Hindus in India have a sacred land in the west known as Shvetadvipa. So he claims that their west is the sacred land of the Hindus, that even the gods know.
Yes. So
That's a very
basically,
tall
then
claim.
in the next paragraph is the more interesting thing. This I conceive to be a most favorable circumstance. As in the present case, the learned have little more than to do than to ascertain whether the White Island be England, the sacred isles of the Hindu, the British Islands. So, after having maturely considered the subject, I think they are. So, you can see where this essay starts itself. They were trying to prop up the idea of England, their colonizer, our colonizer, being the sacred isle of the Hindus, according to their our own Shastra. This also happened in history, so I would like to point that out. But the plot twist comes a bit later, so, little further ahead in the essay. So he starts writing about his experience during the whole translation and collating project. In going on with the collation, I soon perceived that whenever the word Shvetam or Shvetadvipa, the name of the principle of sacredness, and also the whole cluster was introduced, the writing was somewhat different, and that the paper was of a different color, as if stained. Surprised at this strange appearance, I held the page to the light and perceived immediately that there was an erasure and that some size had been applied. So you can imagine that there was some kind of distortion going on. And there is more to this. This happens then. Mm, so going further ahead, so he talks about how a certain Pandit was the one who was helping with all these things, helping him write, compile various translations and so on. And then he finds out that I have since learned that as the money for his establishment passed through his hand, his avaricious disposition led him to embezzle the whole and to attempt to perform the task alone, which was impracticable. So he was making even the Pandit was making somebody else do it. In order to avoid the trouble of consulting books, he conceived the idea of framing legends from what he recollected from the Purana and from what he had picked up in conversation with me. So basically, he found quite a lazy person, and uh, basically he made up a lot of these things. So a- as he was exceedingly well read in the Puranas and other similar books, in consequence of his situation with the Maratha chief, who was the first rank in younger days, it was an easy task for him, and he studied to introduce as much truth as he could to obviate the danger of the immediate detection. Many of the legends were correct, except in the name of the country, which he generally altered to that of Egypt or Shwetam, to basically affirm to this guy that he was finding whatever he wanted to find. So the forgeries were of three kinds. In first, there was only a word or two altered. In the second, there was such legends had undergone a more material alteration. Third, all those which he had written from memory. Basically, he made up entirely. So this is basically to illustrate exactly what was going on in this whole Orientalist project. That so he was. You have to appreciate his honesty compared to other Orientalists, and that their entire epistemological fantasy it comes collapsing. This whole idea that he was searching for Shweta Dvipa, it was being affirmed by someone who was just making stuff up from memory.
Yeah, basically a clever forger who knew what his master wanted to hear. So
Hmm.
they were serving to him whatever he wanted to uh, taste.
So, when you think about it, then this might also another way to interpret this. Might be that those who were working with them, the pundits or the scholars, they would give them what they want, but sometimes forged to fool
Yeah, I
them, to
mean,
keep them away
in
from the
order to
truth.
justify their incomes, they would give them more than what they wanted. But yeah, that is what
No,
led to this incredible amount of noise in the system. We have so much of pollution and so
uh,
many
no, I
wrong.
would like to correct you.
Uh,
Basically, you remember the earlier part, right? That they were already trying to reject them from learning
yes,
Sanskrit and
that's
other
true.
things. Now they found that they were unable to reject them, and somebody would accommodate them.
So
My
as a
theory
decoy
is
to
that
send them, to
they,
distract them and send
yeah, they
them
sent a
in the
decoy.
direction. Okay, yeah,
Exactly,
very good.
because what happens in the next part is this Pandit who gave him all these forgeries. Basically, he gets a bunch of other pundits to confirm that the sources he gives are actually valid. So that makes me convinced of the theory that they were actually trying to fool him purposely.
Okay, right, quite possible.
Hmm. Quite possible. I mean, they had a disdain for them, right? Because they knew their
They
character.
wanted to keep them
I
away.
mean,
They wanted to
But
keep them
now we
away
are
nearby.
burdened with both kinds of literature. That's the point. So we
Exactly.
have to perform a sort of segregation and yeah, separate the noise from the signal.
Yes. So yes, that was basically all in on Orientalism and the earlier years and formation of it. Uh, And the inflection point we see in the later years is when people like James Mill come up. So James Mill comes up with a position of utter contempt. So he's basically a guy who's never been to India, never read Persian, never read Sanskrit even, or you can say never read Persian even. So that is even worse. And he never made any attempt to read much about India before he was commissioned to do so. And his very own preface, he dismisses the idea of Indian knowledge being necessary to know Indian history. He takes it purely from a universal utilitarian perspective that he could read from the reports and decide what India was for himself. So yes, he did not. He was, and his criticism was in that nature as well. That India was barbarous. It was priest-ridden, in his words, in the criticism, Protestant nature, right? It was stagnant and it was intellectually frozen for millennia. So you can kind of think about what this means that 30 years after Jones Sanskrit's Wilkins writing his Gita, Alhed's pundits collaborating with him on the project of making the Code of Gentoo Laws and that whole coterie that Hastings had made. Mill basically declared the entire Orientalist project irrelevant. And he was taken quite seriously, obviously, and he becomes the intellectual father of, you can say, Anglicists in a sense. So this is the seed of doubt, you can say, in Hindu consciousness that will later be planted. That all of your ancient literature and everything, not just it's not even it did not even have a golden age. That was one line of thought that came up with Mill.
Yeah.
So the overall thesis about what did Orientalist project actually do? It was,
Should we cover the portion on
according
the
to
sons
me,
of Noah? I think you missed that. The sons of Noah hypothesis.
that is a lot to cover. But yeah, you
Okay.
can briefly speak on it if you want.
No, just that screenshot if you can just bring up the three sons. I mean, the Trinity thing. That
The
you
Trinity
know,
thing. Okay. Yes,
Ham,
yes.
Shem, and
I'll try to
then
find
the
it once.
that's also convenient placement, right? Ham, Shem, and Japheth.
Yes, yes.
yeah, the difference of James Mill vis-a-vis the earlier Orientalist was this, right? That one had romantic appreciation versus the other had utilitarian contempt. James Mill, who utterly rejected the idea of India was ever civilized, and operating from a strict utilitarian philosophy, he argued that Indian society, laws, and religion were thoroughly barbarous superstitious and backward. So these sort of things we see in the later years, which is
Yes,
also depicted as armchair imperialism by many.
pretty much. Basically, he is entirely dismissive and very self-confident in more than the Orientalist in a sense.
Because he has that strict utilitarian philosophy, right? Focused on rational law,
Yeah.
efficiency, and governance. Anything besides that, if it has a tinge of religion in it, it needs to be called out as despotism and so on.
One or two missionaries have been absurd. Yeah, so enough to argue that the Christian Trinity can directly be correlated with the Hindu Trinity. This was also a very preposterous suggestion, but these attempts were also going on.
Yes. So I think Captain, you were talking about this part
No, actually, I
of
want to talk about
12
something. So, besides that, there was also this other proposition that, as people might be well aware, yes, the sons of Noah are like they are well known as Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So, apparently, the missionaries had this tendency of of assigning ancestry to everyone outside the Christian fold uh, as descend I mean to propose that everyone outside the Christian fold had been descended from Noah, from one of the sons of Noah who went astray. So in Africa they went and suggested that the Africans were descended from Ham, and therefore since Noah had cursed his son Ham, that his descendants would be slaves, the Africans deserve to be enslaved. Much like that, apparently they came to India and they suggested that Brahma,
right.
Vishnu, and
I found this reference. So he starts with Hindustan is a Persian word equally unknown to the old and modern Sanskrit, compounded of Stan, a region, and the word Hind or Hindu. Probably colonial Dawes elegant translation of Firishta's history gives us the true derivation. In the author's conjecture that it is taken from Hind, a supposed son of Ham, the
so there.
son of Noah. Yes, they came from a lot of different angles into this conclusion. This is one of them.
And Jambudeep, again, he claims that Jambudeep comes from a jackal, which is not the case for us at all because Jambu comes from uh, the fruit. So
Yes,
it has nothing to do with jackal at all. Uh, and there are certain other preposterous theories that were proposed, like they proposed that Cain, I mean, their biblical, the sons of Adam were Cain and Abel. They claim that Mohammedans were the sons of Cain, and Ham, yeah, they
and
claim.
an interesting thing, this word Gentoo comes up, and he tries to bring up that Gentoo means animal in general.
Oh, they're fantastic. So more racism.
Yeah,
He claims that Ham is a name of Shiva, and Shem, he equates Shem with Sama, and because Vishnu or Krishna have said among Vedas they are Sama Veda, he ascribes that Shem is Vishnu and Japheth, the third, is equivalent to our Prajapati, and them, since the Jews and the Christians and all the Abrahamics are sons of Japheth, they claim that they are the sons of Brahma or the sons of Prajapati, and therefore they are the true Manavas. So, yeah, that kind of brain rot is going on.
a lot of things like that come up. You can we cannot even discuss it because it goes on and on because he wrote entire basically the PDFs itself are like 400 500 pages each, and each page of them is like worth an essay.
So, yeah, they have speculated entire pages. And again,
Yes.
And by the way,
all of this was rejected by his successor.
Yes, pretty much.
And if asked, if William Jones and other Orientalists would be asked as
Raja
to why
Pachut.
do the actual pundits do not mention these things, these mentions of the Bible, they would then come up with the narrative of the corrupt Brahmin and the decay,
Yeah,
which was always the case with them.
Lot of reference come up. But yeah, in general, you get the idea of it. The kind of ideas we discussed earlier as well about, for example, the idea of Shweta Dvipa, which was turned out to be a forgery itself. And
yeah,
despite it being a forgery, the person goes ahead and publishes it. That he still believes it right before confessing about the forgery. That
precisely.
was quite a strange bit.
Yeah.
So yes, basically coming to conclusion. So what was the Orientalist project wholly about? What is our thesis here? So according to me, that it was basically about producing a version of India for the European tastes. Basically, it was mediated through some pundits and so on, but it was always being, you can say, pampered with in a manner that was for the European tastes. And this the product of this tampering, this version of India, that this mirror of India that was produced, this becomes the mirror in which the educated Hindu elites began to see themselves once they engage with the English enough. Because then the golden age thing becomes real to them, and they see a kind of, they feel that sense of lacking in their own present and their own traditions, because the Orientalist version of the past was pretty much backed by the institutions and all the state and everything, right? So yeah, and the Dark Age, of course, was very real. The European judgment of Indians and Hindus being backward, that was a constant. So yeah, this comes up a lot.
So, for the upcoming stream, which we will have, uh, already exposing this to our audiences now. So, what Nina talked about, we can see this in the character called Rajaram Mohan Roy, where he demonstrated how actually he started to view his own culture through the lens of these very Western narratives, where he accepted the premise that India's tradition had degenerated and needed to be reformed to match the text-based monotheistic and rational standards of the West at that time.
Yes. And this becomes a theme across, you can say, all shades of reformists that come up in the 19th and 20th century. Whether you see the Brahmo Samaj founded by Ramon Roy himself, or the Arya Samaj, Pratna Samaj in Maharashtra, then yes, in general, lot of the reformist movements accepted these premises blindly and went ahead. Or if you were entirely rejecting of these premises, you went the Derosian way, or you entirely just converted to Christianity, like many did actually. So yes, that was the outcome of these worldviews.
Yeah. So let's take up any questions if there are.
Yes. Sahastrikaran, can you highlight any questions if there are any?
Well, there aren't any questions.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, the topic was dense. So yeah.
Yes. So yes, we shall be probably taking up the topic of Ram Mohan Roy and the first, you can say, engagements from the Indian side with all this scholarship-based Orientalist and non-Orientalist scholarships as well, especially the missionaries. That will probably be the theme of our third and next stream. So yes, please do
Yep.
like, share, and subscribe. That was pretty much it. Thank you for viewing the stream.
Thank you so much. Namaskar.
Thank you so much. Jai Shri Ram.
Jai Shri Ram.